Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Anita Nowak, author of Purposeful Empathy, a book about the superpower of empathy for transformation. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Anita Nowak, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Hello.
So Anita, you are an empathy evangelist. So what is empathy? Let's start with the obvious. What is it?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. The way that people usually define empathy in my workshops, when I ask, an audience, what does empathy mean to you? It typically breaks down into three answers: stepping into someone else's shoes, seeing through someone else's eyes, or feeling what someone else is feeling. And I tell my audience that those are all perfectly valid answers. And then I share some of what I've learned over the last 10 years to sort of add nuance or depth or gravitas to what empathy is. And I guess the first thing I would probably want to share is that it's not like these other words, pity, sympathy, or compassion, even though those are treated like synonyms. So I actually, for my PhD, put them on a continuum. So on one side was pity, followed by sympathy, followed by compassion, followed by empathy. And on the pity side of that continuum, there's power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. Oh, you poor person. And you kind of look down on them.
Right.
But as you make your way across the continuum to empathy, there's this understanding, there's recognition that we share a common humanity. So we all have access to things like fear and shame and joy and love. So that's what gives us sort of the opportunity to empathize, because we have those common feelings, but we don't deny or discount lived experience. So everybody experiences life differently. And so we don't want to project onto them.
So why is it important to me? I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business. It's my business. Don't I just get to do what I want? Isn't that what the manual tells me?
Empathy is so important in the workplace. I have been posting daily empathy posts for, I'm very close to 2,500 consecutive days, which is over 6.5 years. And back in the day when I first started posting these, I had to go searching for empathy stories. The last 2-3 years, the internet has been awash in empathy stories, empathic leadership, empathic cultures, empathic relationships. As you can imagine, the pandemic really shifted gears, where people recognize that people want to come into a workplace where they're treated as whole human beings. They care about a sense of belonging. The EDI issue has kind of surfaced. Obviously, empathy is important to product design or service delivery. If you've studied anything like design thinking, like anything that we are using, right? Zoom as we're using it now, I don't know, maybe there's a desk that your laptop is sitting on, that was designed. Everything we touch or feel or use was designed. And good design, it takes the user experience as the center of the design process. And that, of course, requires empathy. So across the entire chain, across all stakeholder groups, empathy is important.
Yeah, and you know what? Thank you for that, Anita. And kidding aside, I'm in the middle of my doctoral process, focused on human ingenuity. And one of the things we're releasing from SpyderWorks is a human ingenuity game. And the very first step is about empathy and understanding the roles and relationships with the other people in the room. Because yes, while I kid about it, the old entrepreneurial paradigm of it's all about me, it isn't. It never is. It's about your customer. It's about your team member. It's about whoever is in the room that this is going to, or not in the room that this is going to touch. So I'm so glad that you've come on to share a little bit more of the facts behind the thinking.
But I'm glad you get it, because not everybody does. Like, I'm going to share two stats that caught my attention when I was doing the research for the book. 2/3 of employees believe that empathy is critical to business success. Okay. But 1 out of 5 say it's rewarded at work. Okay. That's one stat. The second stat is the lion's share of CEOs, so 84% of CEOs believe that it's critical to the bottom line, but 7 out of 10 say if I showed it at work, I'd be less respected. So we have to debunk these myths and invite more empathy into our workplace because people are craving it.
Well, so yes, it's debunking the myths. But that's why I asked what it was off the top. You know, I don't think that people understand that when they're developing a customer persona, that is based on empathy for the people who are going to buy or use or rent or whatever your products or services. That when they do a team member persona of who should fit in, what the culture is, who fits, that you're actually being highly empathetic if in fact you're doing this properly. So maybe people just don't even know when they're being or exhibiting or using empathy.
Yeah, because I think we tend to see empathy as something in our personal lives, right? Oh, somebody is suffering. Yeah. We go hang out with them. We listen to their story and we have empathy for what they're going through. And so that's one part of empathy. That's the compassion part of empathy. It is the feeling what someone else is feeling, and our mirror neurons get lit up when we are in emotional resonance with someone. That's why when somebody stubs their toe, we wince. That's why when we listen to a horror movie, we're scared by the music, and if we turn down the volume, all of a sudden the music, the visual is not as scary anymore. That has to do with affect. It's emotional contagion. But not all empathy is like that. We have something known as cognitive empathy, which is taking the perspective of another. And that's a choice, which is why my book is called Purposeful Empathy. It's empathy on purpose. So I think that's really an important distinction to make.
So talk a little bit more about that on purpose. I mean, one, again, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, whenever I've run innovation or ingenuity or entrepreneurship team building exercises, I always have people flip roles, and maybe 3, 4, 5 times, different levels within an organization, different functions. And then outside of the organization, what is the customer thinking? What is the supplier thinking? So talk to me about purpose or purposeful empathy. How do we formalize it?
Well, it's the decision to be empathic. So I remember learning a lot about the neuroscience of empathy and the fact that we can become more empathic with practice. There's research out of Stanford with Jamil Zaki, who says even believing that it's possible to become more empathic actually has a positive benefit on empathic behavior. Now, when I was coming across this research, I started doing all sorts of experiments. I would go to the drive-through and I would pay it forward. I would do random acts of kindness. I was trying to really see what it was like to flex my empathy muscles. And this is a story I've told before, but it's worth sharing again. I was in a long lineup at a FedEx store in the holiday season about 12 or 13 years ago, before we all had phones attached to our hands to distract us. So it took about 30 minutes before I got to the counter, and the woman who greeted me was rude. And not just a little bit rude, I just mean like it was affronting. Okay, like my body, I was like, whoa, what's wrong with you? And I wanted to call her out on it and say, like, how dare you talk to me like that? But because I had been studying the neuroscience of empathy and the fact that we could switch on our empathic proclivity, I just said, okay, well, let me try this. So I looked at her and I said, are you okay? And she took a little minute to see whether or not I was being sarcastic or not. And she knew I was being serious and sincere. And she burst into tears and she said, Anita, I've been working, well, she didn't know my name, but she said to me, I've been working 2 weeks straight, double shifts. My son's at home with a fever. I think I'm getting sick. It's 3 p.m. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just exhausted. And this woman that I hated 20 seconds ago, all of a sudden we're holding hands across the FedEx counter, both of us tearing up in this, what I call an empathic embrace. So it's choosing to be empathic on purpose. And we need that for our classrooms. We need that for our workplaces. We need it for our public policies, where we need to make decisions where we regard the needs and the situations and contexts of others more carefully. Because I think there's a lot going on in the world that we're like living in our own little bubble and just carrying on with life. And it's almost like society has designed it to actually keep a limit on how much we empathize. And I think as human beings, we survived and thrived thanks to our empathic capacity. And I could say more about that, but I think we need to resurrect that.
You know what? Say more about that empathic capacity. If I can
Sure.
get that out of my mouth right. Empathic
Yeah,
capacity.
sure. People who study our evolution say that about 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not the only ones on planet Earth with large brains. There were other large brain species wandering the Earth with us, but we're the ones that survived. And they ask themselves, why is that? So they do research on our physiology, and they've come to the conclusion that relatively speaking, we lost most of our facial hair. Relatively speaking, our testosterone dropped. And the biggest indicator is the whites of our eyes grew really big. Now, you tell me, have you been to a meeting where you've shared a knowing glance at somebody as something else is going on and you said it all? Well, it turns out that that knowing glance has been with us for a long time. It's the way that we were able to read each other across distance so that we could collaborate against whatever the common enemy was. So the researchers say that empathy, that capacity to imagine what someone else is going through, has been part of our successful evolution. And we really, I think, in the face of climate change and wealth inequality, we need to leverage our empathy on purpose for greater peace in the world, greater justice in the world, and also more purposeful lives. One of the things I like to share often is that, we're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Once our baseline needs are met and we climb up the hierarchy, we get to what's known, or what he called self-actualization, where we become our full potential. Now, just before he died, he actually admitted, and he was writing profusely, how wrong and how limited his own model was, that in fact, it's not just about self-actualization, it's about what he called self-transcendence, this idea of living a life that's of greater service or greater purpose than your own lived personal experience. And I think that that is, again, something that's missing from our culture too. We take care of our own family and our own friends, but what about enlarging that circle of care and concern to people beyond our immediate cluster? I think that's what's needed in our world.
So as you discuss that, or you mentioned that what's needed in our world, we bounced around a little bit. We've talked a little bit about business, about personal level. What are the three levels or scales of empathy? Like my understanding, there's some around personal, organizational, and social. How do you differentiate, or how do you apply to each of them?
Yeah, so the title of the book is called Purposeful Empathy, and then the subtitle is Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. And I think it's really important to sort of identify those three levels of scale, because when you're in a relationship with someone and you show up with empathy, the person that you're in relationship with feels heard and supported, and that improves the quality of the relationship. And it turns out that, like, for example, that story that I shared in FedEx, if I had been tied up to a fMRI machine, or if there were some other mechanisms to sort of gauge how my physiology was doing at that moment, in an empathic embrace, when you're feeling emotionally connected to someone, our heart rate stabilizes, our immune system functions better, the pleasure and reward centers of our brain light up, oxytocin and serotonin flood our body. So not only are there physiological improvements to our bodies, but it also matters to our brain. Like, people who've studied the pleasure and reward centers of our brain, when we're eating chocolate cake or when we're high on psychedelics, it's the pleasure and reward centers that light up. Same thing when we're feeling emotionally connected to somebody. So there are a host of personal benefits on a relationship level to engage in more purposeful empathy. But then in the organizational context, if you think about sort of some of the meta changes that have happened over the last few years, whether it's the Great Resignation, for example, why did that happen? Well, people were starting to evaluate how they're spending their time and their talent at work. Did they want to work 40 or 50 hours a week for an organization that kind of didn't treat them so well? No. And so they left. So we saw, tens of thousands of people leave their jobs. So it matters to attracting talent, and it matters to retaining talent. It also matters that you have an empathic workplace sort of to fight against to bolster psychological safety, which people want, right? It matters for any EDI conversation. It matters for this new trend called quiet quitting, where people are only doing the sort of to the T what their job description says and nothing else. So there's a lot of research that's showing it matters to communication and even innovation, because as people trust each other more in the workplace, there tends to be greater risk taking and greater, social capital as people collaborate better. So there's just a ton of material evidence that it matters to the bottom line that you have more empathic leaders and more empathic organizations. Then at the societal level, given what we're facing in terms of climate change and, the fact, think about it. There are 8 men on the planet that have the same combined wealth as half of humanity, which is outrageous. Right. So, and we're starting to see how society is disintegrating thanks to these great cleavages in wealth and income inequality. So I think just across the board, more empathy is really needed.
So as you're describing that, and you talked a little bit about, plutocracy, the divide between the wealth and the non-wealthy, if you will. One of the exercises I do, and I started thinking about it a little differently as you were speaking, is around macro trends. It's having an understanding of what's coming into the future and what our world might look like or feel like. And the future can be 6 months away. It doesn't have to be 60 years. It seems that if we did a little bit more of this, we would be training or bringing out our empathy muscle. And what I mean again is, you're talking about the Great Resignation and things like that. Realistically, 40 years ago, we knew this was going to happen pretty much to the quarter. We knew that the population was going to be aging, that our workforce was going to be in decline. And if supply goes in decline, obviously people get to pick and choose and switch around more. So there's empathy, but there's almost this built-in, I don't want to say ignorance in like a negative way, but like we choose not to look forward. We choose not to look across the table. And how do we help ourselves to do that? Because for me, it's about opening our eyes and speaking to people and looking a little bit forward of 3 feet away from you.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said about how our brains tend to address the things that are right in front of us as opposed to long-term planning. And certainly our politics follows that same rule. If we were paying attention to the long run, we wouldn't be facing the climate change disaster that we're up against at the moment. I think the same thing can be said about all that's happening with AI right now, is that, there's a few leaders out there that are calling attention to like putting a moratorium on all the AI development. So at least we can assess things and put the proper guardrails in place. And I don't know if that's actually translating into action. So who knows what the future holds in that regard. One of the things I thought where you were going with the conversation is, if people have the more choice in terms of where they're going to work, the rise of the robot is coming as well. I thought you were going to ask a question about technology, and I was kind of getting ready to answer that, because I often get asked, what do you think about empathy and technology? Yeah. And I remember having this experience a few years ago. I work at McGill. I teach at McGill University. And I was invited to participate in a 2-day-long conference on the future of education. So the goal was to actually imagine what it would be like to be teaching at McGill in the year 2050. And to start the day off, they had a couple of presentations. I remember one was a multidisciplinary team that rolled out a computer on sitting on it was a big flat screen on a table. And it was one of the women on the team sat with the computer, and out comes a hologram, and they called this hologram Larry. And she shared a sad story with Larry, and Larry responded saying, "Oh, so what I hear you say is," it was like he was responding like a therapist might, right? And I remember the feeling in the room, this like total cleavage of sighs. Like everybody gasped, but it was two kinds of gasps. One was like maybe the technologists and the engineers and the software developers, like, oh, how cool is that? And then you had like half the room of the humanists and the social scientists saying, oh my gosh, what's going on? And my feeling was, how can we, think that we just program a bunch of codes and all of a sudden we have these like makeshift robot therapists that's somehow going to solve a problem. And their feedback at this conference was, look, we already know there aren't enough therapists out there for the rise in mental health. What if people who were not inclined to reach out for support and are being kind of called in by the dark corners of the internet, what if they had sort of 24-hour chat bots to connect with? Maybe that could help in some way. And I still remember feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're resigning ourselves to machines supporting us in our darkest hour. Look, I think that there's an opportunity for technology to help us in many ways. I know in Japan, for example, they have robots that go into elder care homes where folks are suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. And those robots, if they're able to communicate and can listen to the same story for the 10,000th time, that's better than not having a guest visit at all. So I understand that there are some applications, but I worry about young people growing up in a machine-dominated space where, one of the things I do in my classroom is we do a simple eye gazing exercise where we look into each other's eyes for 2 minutes. And there are students that are wiping away tears. I do this with my corporate clients too. And often in the debrief, students will say to me, I don't remember the last time I looked into someone else's eyes. And so I don't know, there's a tension for me that the more machines anthropomorphize, that there's risks, and who controls the technology, that's also a risk.
So one, there's a lot to unpack in there, but one of the things, I mean, when I started into the human ingenuity work, I created an ingenuity pyramid, and to make it simple, it goes from head to the heart to the gut. And the head obviously being binary, zeros, ones, computer-like. And we can figure out what the heart and the gut are with emotion and the gut reaction. When you're talking about some of these assessments, I almost wonder, one, all we're really talking about the computer or the robot in Japan being able to do is taking baseline questions down of you. Are you thinking this way? Are you thinking that way, etc. And give me a score of 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, of how you're feeling. I don't have this well articulated because it's just popping in my head as you're saying it, but would we be more truthful speaking to a robot than a human? If we're talking about our possible shortcomings or our fears or our insecurities. So would we be on that first screening level? Would it actually be better to remove, not to remove empathy, but to just get down to a binary level of give me the 0, 5, 10 or whatever number it is, and then we can bounce up, but with more accurate insight or information?
Well, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but what comes to mind is when I was leaving on my book tour, my first flight out of Trudeau Airport involved a canceled flight, not a delayed flight, but an outright canceled flight. And so I found myself in the lineup at customer care at the airline, and I was in line next to a woman, and both of us were being cared for by 2 customer care agents. And I guess maybe I wanted to put my book tour off on a good note and had the psychic space and bandwidth to sort of be kind to this gentleman, read his name on his name tag, and we had a bit of a chat, where she was having none of it. And I know that there have been days where I have been in her shoes where it's like, no, you've got to find me a solution. Like, this is not acceptable. But she was being kind of tough and rude to her customer care agent. And so I imagine that there are probably applications for, chat GPT or chat, whatever the AI is, to come in and help down-regulate somebody and respond in such a way that the person feels heard without sort of the emotional triggers that come with somebody, talking to you in a way that is actually offensive or rude. So there's probably space for that. But at the end of the day, I still think the human condition does have friction. And I think we would be better served if we actually learned how to overcome friction and become better at relating to each other than replacing ourselves with technology. I don't know. There's something.
Is friction relieved though? If while you were waiting, you downloaded a certain amount of information for the customer care agent to process, because now you're waiting 30 minutes, and I've been there too, and I'm trying to be happy and positive, but hey, when you've been waiting 8 hours in a snowstorm, it can go out the window no matter how hard you try. But if they are more informed, not just of the facts, but of what's bothering you about the situation and what the possible solution is, would that actually reduce friction when you come face to face with the individual?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly know the experience speaking to humans, where there's been training, obviously, that has gone into the customer care call, where I'll share a frustration and they'll say something like, gosh, that sounds terrible. I'm really sorry that happened. And then move it on to the next thing. Just that one sentence actually can be quite a balm to the conversations, like the direction the conversation takes, right? If you're dealing with somebody who's on a customer care call and they seem to be sort of flippant about your own experience, that just makes it worse, especially if you've waited a long time and you've pressed a lot of buttons to get it. So I don't know. I think that we prefer to feel like we're being heard by a human than a machine. But in some instances, I can understand why a machine might actually be able to do a better job of down regulating than a human, because they have no skin in the game, literally.
And in these 5 minutes, Anita, we've shown this massive, massive issue that we're all going to be dealing with as managers, as leaders, as humans, of what is that balance between human and impersonal in a very technical or technological way. And I think that's hey, it's tough. It's tough, and it's going to be really interesting to see how industry by industry or interaction types, how this all fleshes out. So Anita, as our time comes to a close today, you have mentioned your book tour a few times now. So just tell us specifically a little bit about, where have you been on the tour? Where are you going? Who is this book of interest to?
Well, thanks for asking. I did the East Coast first. So I was in DC and New York and Boston and Toronto. And then out West, I was in Seattle, Vancouver, and Calgary. I've spoken to all different kinds of organizations and smaller book clubs and, big headquartered offices, Starbucks, and oil and gas, law firms, finance. It seems that there's a bit of an appetite for empathy across the board. I think people recognize that we're all fried a little bit like bacon. Our brains cannot be in a state of stress and anxiety and empathy simultaneously. And the last couple of years have taken a lot out of us. And I think there's just this understanding implicitly, like, hey, we better turn up the volume of empathy in our lives because, we need to get along a little bit better. The polarization across the political domain is also another kind of worrying sign. So I think the message that I want to talk about when it comes to reading the book is that, okay, purposeful empathy is not a new to-do to add to your list. It turns out that you benefit. Your relationships, your workplace, your society benefits when you engage in purposeful empathy. So why not?
Well, thank you for that, Anita Nowak. The book is Personal Empathy. Thank you so much for joining us on Say Hi to the Future today.
Great. Thanks for having me.